are going to listen to and hopefully participate in a debate about the use and abuse of democratic self-defense. This event has been organized jointly by our institute and the Institute of Ideas in London, which is represented here by Angus Kennedy. He is going to moderate tonight's debate. This event is part of an international debate festival called the Battle of Ideas, which is organized by the Institute of Ideas each year, I think each October, across the UK. And as our department has a long history in organizing debates and workshops on cultural, political and media issues, current issues, we were thrilled to be part of debate festival of this kind. And when Angus asked us, or suggested that we pick a topic for tonight's debate that is connected to the very broad issue of tolerance, we decided at last on a topic that goes back a long way, but which has been rediscussed in and outside of Hungary recently from new angles and based on new and often very worrying experience. So the initial question of the debate tonight is: what is the best or least bad strategy for democratic states and societies to handle or contain extremist views, extremist actions, extremist groups? So I wish us all a very thought-provoking debate, and please feel encouraged in the second part of the evening to share your own ideas, make comments or ask questions. Thank you, and please.
Thanks very much, Nana, and thanks to having us here. This is actually our second debate that we organised in Budapest. We had one last year, but it's a great privilege to come back and do one here at ELTE. My name's Angus Kennedy, and as Anna said, I work at the Institute of Ideas in London, organising public debates in the UK, but I also organise the programme of events as part of the annual Battle of Ideas Festival internationally across Europe. We have a few in the United States and a few in India actually last year, but predominantly across Europe. Just trying to stimulate public discussion about, in a no-holds barred fashion. The motto of the Battle of Ideas is free speech allowed, and we do mean it on something about free speech absolutists. So, as Anna said, when we get to the second half of the discussion where you can all take part, there are no limits in terms of asking controversial, heretical, difficult questions or making difficult points. We want you to put the panel under pressure, not just listen to what they have to say. So the kind of spirit of these debates is to try and get something a bit like a rally, but not out of control dinner party. The format for the event, I'll give a very quick introduction now and promise not to go on long, and then we'll introduce the speakers in the order they're going to speak. And they're going to give short introductions, sort of 5 to 7 minutes each, to just give a flavour of where they stand on the topic. And then I'll try and pull out any kind of points of disagreement or areas that I think need clarity among the panel, and then go out to you for the balance, at least half of the discussion. I agree with Anna very much in terms of the importance of doing this discussion, not just in Hungary actually, but everywhere in Western liberal democracies at the moment. I think that it's certainly not an academic discussion, although we are in a university and have an academic panel. I think it's a very real political and social issue, the question of what the limits, if you like, to democracy might be. Where should it draw the line when it feels itself under attack? And I think it would be good for us in the discussion to try and think through the broad social and political trends at a universal level, that rather than get dragged down too much into particulars, of what is happening in Hungary. Bring up examples by all means, but I do think that we'll find through the examining the notion of tolerance and democratic self-defense that we can find broader trends going on in society at the moment. Looking at the questions of whether democracy needs to be insulating itself against the will of the majority, for example, is that because it's actually under threat, or does that desire reflect a certain degree of lack of confidence in the values of liberal democracy among the people at the top of society? Certainly in the UK we get a lot of calls for bans on hate speech, racist speech, xenophobia, for the security forces, the police, to be much more proactive in targeting extremists and radicals in universities, all in the name of protecting a tolerant society from an intolerance that is said to be attacking it. Which is, raises a very real question in terms of, can a democracy afford to tolerate people who are intolerant, or could we pose the question the other way round, and can we actually afford not to be tolerant? Maybe the best way to defend democracy is to be more democratic and not less. So those are just some of the themes that we can come to in the discussion. In terms of my panel, I'll introduce them in the order they're going to speak. First of all, András Jakab, on my right. András is a Schumpeter Fellow. I'll introduce all.
Yeah, shall I stand up? Hi.
No, you don't, whatever you're comfortable with, András. I'll introduce everybody first, and then we can get going. So András is a Schumpeter Fellow at the Planck Institute for Comparative Public and International Law in Heidelberg. He studies law, economy, philosophy here at ELTE, and he's taught at a number of universities in Hungary, and in Spain, England and Germany, and he's published on legal theory and constitutional law. Thank you for joining us, András. Give a round of applause. Second to speak, and this kind of tests my Hungarian, but Szabolcs Pogonyi teaches political theory and ethics here at ELTE. He's also a visiting professor in nationalism studies at CEU, Central European University, writes on citizenship theory, multiculturalism, and the issues of minority rights. He edits Phronesis, which is a political philosophy quarterly, and Budapest, which is a review of Hungarian politics. So, Szabolcs, thank you for joining us. Third to speak on my left will be Frank Furedi. He's Professor of Sociology at the University of Kent in Canterbury in the United Kingdom. He's written many books, Wasted, about what's happening to education at the moment, The Politics of Fear, most recently a book called On Tolerance in Defense of Moral Independence, which was one of the motivations, I think, for wanting to organise this session on this theme. Frank's a regular speaker at Institute of Ideas events. He's always very challenging and thought-provoking to listen to, and is also a widely heard commentator in the UK and a public intellectual looking at the dominant trends in society today. So thank you for joining us. And finally to speak will be András Pap. András is head of the Department for Constitutional Law and Human Rights at the Hungarian Academy of Sciences, and also an associate professor here at ELTE. He's taught in the US, too many universities in Hungary to mention. He sits on lots of editorial boards and academic journals, and published over six books, I think. Is that right? More now? Probably. So and well over 200 articles. So thank you for joining us, András. So, András, if you want to make a start.
Thank you very much. We just have 5 minutes, so I'm going to be brief. My ambition is to propose some thoughts or some questions for the later debate. First of all, the idea of democratic self-defense or militant democracy, it's actually not new. And the idea, already during the French Revolution, Saint-Just actually said that there is no freedom for the enemies of the freedom, which already shows the dilemma behind the whole idea, because when we think of Saint-Just, we don't think of, freedom fighter or maybe some you might, but I rather think of a terrorist sitting or using the machinery of the state against its citizens. So this is the basic dilemma. In the name of protecting the freedom, in the name of protecting democracy, how much state enforcement can be used against the citizens. And then later, of course, the idea came up, especially during the Weimar Republic. And nowadays, when we talk about this topic, then most of the literature begins with Weimar and actually Löwenstein, a political philosopher, constitutional lawyer, who wrote a famous article about militant democracy, or thereafter Demokratie in the 30s, end of 30s, when he already had to leave Germany. There are different instruments. I'm a constitutional lawyer, so I always think of legal instruments, how you can do it. And there are different ways how you can protect democracy against anti-democratic threats. I mean, the usual ones, just to mention a few, the usual ones are to prohibit anti-democratic parties, which is usual practice in many European countries, also anti-democratic associations. Also, it's a usual reason to limit fundamental rights. So, in case you want to use it in order to destroy democracy, then you just can't use it. So, it's a good justification how your fundamental right might be limited by the state. And also an interesting instrument, Germany actually. In Germany, it is forbidden to modify even the constitution if this modification would destroy democracy. There are so-called Ewigkeitsklausel, so clauses in the constitution which are meant to be forever. And in this way, you can protect democracy, not just against the normal majority, but you can protect democracy even against the whole population. So you just have few people at the Constitutional Court. In Germany, there are 16 people in the Constitutional Court, so they can protect the democracy even against 80 million anti-democratic fascists or communists. And the idea is, how can they decide what is really the democracy against the 80 million? Is one of the main criticisms why some people say that this idea is actually misplaced to protect democracy against the democratic majority. But I leave it.
Okay, thank you, András.
So I will also try to be brief, and I will continue from where András ended. That is protecting democracy from the majorities. I mean, I'm a philosopher, and I will try to say philosophical hair-splitting as much as possible, but there is one thing I think I would need to discuss, and that is democracy and its meaning. I mean, everyone in everyday parlance speaks about democracy, and we kind of think that we understand what we mean by this. By democracy, we usually mean the rule of law, the democratic institutions, and certain practices and rules that are prevalent in democratic societies. Now, but if you just look at the meaning of the term and the emergence of the term democracy, and go back to ancient Greece, and analyze the term, you will see that democracy actually means that the majority should rule, the people should rule, which implies that the majority should rule. So when we speak about protecting democracy from the majority, it seems to be a controversy. So I'm not sure whether this could be understood by someone in Athens. Democracy implies that the majority rules. Now, when we're speaking about militant democracy, we're asking a question that, as András briefly discussed, goes back primarily to the Weimar Republic. András mentioned Löwenstein, so I won't speak about him. I think the term was coined by himself, Karl Löwenstein, militant democracy. But earlier, surprisingly, another famous German philosopher and legal scholar, Carl Schmitt, wrote about democracy and the weakness of democracy in a very similar term. Of course, he was a conservative in the early 20s, he was a conservative legal scholar, and he criticized democracy and liberal democracy particularly for what he considered as its basic and inherent weakness. That is, if Democrats, liberal Democrats can do nothing against any kind of either left-wing or right-wing radicals, once these radicals secure themselves majority in the parliament. Liberal democracy, according to this conservative, then conservative critique of liberalism, entails that you only have a couple of rules, that is, democratic rules, which are neutral. If you play by the rules and you win the elections, you do whatever you want to, you're legitimate. And Carl Schmitt and others argue that it will not be very successful. Liberal democracies cannot maintain themselves in the long run. Now, what I'd like to just probably more provocatively put than I think, so I'm not really convinced, but let me just put it more provocatively than I think. So, is it true? Is it true that liberal democracies cannot defend themselves? Is it really true that liberal democrats assume that you just have to provide a possibility for everyone to discuss his or her ideas, and then in the long run, some kind of truth will win? And this was the assumption of the idealistic liberals of the 19th century, that once you have a real open discussion, a real public debate, it can't happen that the true ideas will not win at the end of the day. And after the 30s, it became apparent to many liberals, well, that it's probably far too optimistic to assume so. And in the second part of the 20th century, leading political philosophers dealing with the question of militant democracy, most of them not mentioning this term, but speaking about toleration and the toleration of the intolerant, reached the conclusion that liberal democracies cannot be fully tolerant. They have to, by definition, stand up very much against undemocratic radicals. John Rawls, probably the most important 20th century political philosopher, in his later works outlined that whomever is not sharing the basic principles of human equality should be forced. That is, they cannot participate in the open and public discussions. And I think this approach is not very far from liberalism. So I would not say that in a liberal republic you should leave the possibility to discuss his or her ideas openly. So yeah, that's very briefly what I think.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
Thank you. Just following on, I mean, if you look at classical liberalism, the position is very simple, that it's not that liberalism argues that open debate will lead to the truth, because that would be totally idiotic to assume there's a spontaneous process to the truth. But what it does suggest is that the one that you can guarantee is that without open debate, the truth will never be achieved. Which is why open debate and total tolerance is a precondition for anything that's remotely progressive and anything that kind of clarifies the differences. And the thing that I'm concerned about is I've been doing a series of lectures in Scandinavia, America, Australia, and elsewhere. What I'm really concerned about is that a lot of left-wing people, progressive people, intellectual people, who historically would have been in the forefront to fight for the freedom of speech and for democratic rights, are now spending far more of their energy in discovering why tolerance should be curbed. You know, why in this particular case we cannot give them free speech. And yes, you know, they can speak whatever they want, but I don't like because they're a little bit racist, or they're a little bit anti-Semitic, or a little bit xenophobic, or they're homophobic. And everywhere I go, you know, people's idea of tolerance is to be tolerant of the guys that they agree with. That's okay, he thinks like I do. But those people there, they are very threatening. So what we've done is we kind of intellectually institutionalized a real robust sense of a double standard. And we kind of flatter ourselves being tolerant, but actually we're as intolerant as the next. And the sad thing is that what we've done, and this has become almost institutionalized in the EU and elsewhere, is we've accepted a very sordid idea. And the idea is basically a trade-off between freedom and security. And if you want to know what this trade-off means, look at the Bush regime in the United States. You know, after 9/11, their argument was that if we kind of took away people's freedom this much, you know, maybe not very much, maybe just this much, then we'll become this much more secure. That's the argument. And of course, as you know, because you're all intelligent, university-educated people, when you trade away your freedom, you don't actually ever become more secure. Historically, you become more and more insecure as a result of that. And we're doing the same thing now. We basically say, well, we can trade off a bit of freedom of speech. Only, in these instances, you cannot say these words. You cannot criticize those people. You can't attack those people in exchange for security. The tragedy is that whenever you have the trade-off between freedom and security, you become more insecure because you actually perpetuate the politics of fear, but also you've given away the moral high ground of being a democrat. And it seems to me that unless you occupy the moral high ground, from a democratic standpoint, from the point of view of freedom, there's no way you have the legitimacy to criticize the racists, the anti-Semites, all those people whose views you kind of dislike. So my position is that the way you fight intolerance is not by being tolerant, not by adopting their ethical position, not by adopting their ethos. The way you fight intolerance is by tolerance. And the way you fight people who attack democracy is with more democracy. Because every experience in history shows that if you make the slightest concessions to backward anti-democratic sentiments, you end up actually giving way to the enemies of freedom and to the enemies of democracy. So I think that view is important. I just want to end by a little story. When I was 9 years old, I used to live just around the corner. And I remember, this was in September 1956. I remember very clearly, my sister was in a gymnasium called Verespáni, just around the corner there. She used to drag me to these meetings. I mean, the students were having big discussions about what should be done and everything else. And I remember this guy getting up at a meeting, and he basically said, we mustn't do anything. It's important we don't do anything, because whatever we think of the government, at least they're keeping all the bad, fascistic, right-wing, racist people from speaking. That was the argument. And that kind of apology for the Stalinist regime actually contributed to the situation where what happened afterwards became totally unclear. And instead of people gaining real insights about what should be done, the whole situation became totally confused and falsely polarized. And it seems to me that whenever we argue, let's keep quiet because they're keeping the bad people away, what you're doing is you're giving up on the idea that political arguments and clarity about democracy can triumph. We're basically saying we've lost. We're looking for bureaucratic administrative solutions instead of politics or philosophy.
Thank you. I'm just going to throw in a couple of random thoughts. First of all, to continue where Szabolcs started. So, what is democracy? I think when we talk about democracy, we clearly are not referring to the decision-making process that builds on the majority's will. When we talk about democracy, I think we're talking about something bigger. We're talking about democracy as a decision-making process, as a principle of decision-making process, plus something else. When we talk about democracy, I think we talk about constitutional democracies, and that is very important. Democracy is not liberty. Democracy is not unlimited freedom. Unlimited freedom is anarchy. Democracy is a coexistence under the exception of certain rules. Now, we always seem to have sort of this rhetoric of paradoxes. I think that there is a contra-majoritarian dilemma. That is, we are in a democracy, yet there are inherent in almost all of our working democracies, we see certain limitations of a democracy. What are these? I will just name three. Several has already been mentioned. First of all, judicial review. I mean, most well-working constitutional democracies have something like a constitution, well, have constitutions. If they have that, they usually have constitutional courts. Sometimes they don't call them constitutional courts, like in the United States, it's the Supreme Court. But basically what they say that certain legislative actions of the lawmaker, of Parliament or Congress, however you call them, that is the body that is legitimately making the rules for the community. There is a body that is not elected or either appointed by the president or so they're not voted by the people. These elite lawyers or elite politicians can actually overrule the decisions of an elected body. This is one of the counter-majoritarian dilemmas. In several countries, following the Vienna example, we see constitutional solutions that either have these rigid clauses that András referred to, that the constitutions say that, okay, you can do a lot of things, we have parliament, we have the president, etc., but this you cannot change. These are the fundamental principles of how this community wants to live. You cannot change the democratic nature or notion within the state, etc. Also, another, I guess, dilemma within democracy is when you have supermajorities. This country, when in 1989 adopted a new constitution, basically have installed a number of laws where you need to have more than a democratic requirement. You need to have 2/3 of members of parliament to adopt a law. This is something that is supposed to give a higher amount of legitimacy for decision making, for making decisions. Yet, of course, it's not democratic because it's not the majority. So what I'm saying is that you know, so when we talk about democracy, I think these are all seem to be okay. Life is full of paradoxes. Art is about paradoxes. We can love and hate at the same time. We can love and be annoyed at the same time by the same person. So I think it very much applies to political institutions as well. Basically, this dilemma, this sort of contra-majoritarian dilemma, is nothing else but the articulation of the norm that this is the exception that proves the rule. This is something that makes the general rule, which again I need to emphasize is not only the freedom. This is something that makes the societies work. Now, of course, the problem with this is, and I'm not arguing with anybody with you here, is that of course the problem with exceptions is that we can have a sweeping rhetoric of exceptions. Where do we stop? I think you know you can live with rules that have certain exceptions to them, but the problem is where do you stop from making these exceptions? And of course a lot will depend on the traditions of states, how patronizing they get. And the big problem with this, with the sort of new exceptions that we see, for example, after the 9/11 terrorist attacks, etc., is that the stakeholders, the people seem to be also happy and willing to live with these exceptions. We have to see that there are very huge corporate interests in these open-ended processes of war against terrorism, war against crime, war against drugs, war against immigration. These are, you know, when does the war end? We don't know. We are really willing to trade in liberty for security. And of course there is the famous quotation that if you're willing to give in liberty, a small degree of liberty for a certain proportion of security, you will lose both and deserve neither. So this is really the context. But let me just finish by saying that I'm actually, you know, in general okay with certain exceptions. I think this is, you know, we live our lives with certain limited degrees of exceptions to general rules. The problem is where do we draw these lines? But I do think that it is okay. It is an inherent capacity or quality of a democracy that it should have certain paradoxes within, if you want to phrase it that way. The way I want to phrase it, this is something that makes these political constructions sustainable. That's it, I have to say.
Okay, so that's got us started. Can I just pull out some of those themes, and maybe I'll start with you, András. I mean, you mentioned the German constitution, which has these sort of fortifications built in, so you're not allowed to actually vote it away, the eternal parts of the German constitution. How much faith do you put in those? You referenced in your introduction that they're there as a defense against the power of 80 million imagined fascists, or 80 million imagined communists. Would the law hold up in that kind of situation?
Well, of course not. I mean, that's just a general idea of what the law should do, but if there are 80 million communists or fascists in a country and 60 constitutional judges who don't want it, then it's just hopeless, the whole thing. Obviously, the law leaves from some kind of you know, social background. Even if it's a dictatorship, you do need some, you know, some social background for a law. Just 16 people won't be sufficient. That's for true. So that's one of the usual criticisms, which says that, you know, just by building up certain legal instruments to protect democracy, it's not enough. What you actually need is a cultural background, and maybe in certain cases it can help, but it's actually not the real point. You know, this bomb mode that, you know, the Weimar Republic was republic without republicans and so on. So I mean, if you have such a situation, I'm not sure how much the saying was true, but anyway, if you're such a situation, then it's pretty hopeless.
Would you think yourself the balance should be maybe between democratic values and reliance on the law?
I mean, of course, constitutional lawyers spend a lot of time to separate the two concepts, but in practice, and there are beautiful explanations what the exact content of these concepts are, but in practice, to separate the two nowadays in the 21st century is just not possible. So it's difficult to say that we should have this and then the other we work. Somehow two things work together.
So, well, can I ask you, I mean, you took us back to ancient Greece and the concept of democracy there, which, literally means the force of the people. And in ancient Greece, it was the armed force of the people. The voting body carried spears and shields. So that was a militant democracy in a way that seems the opposite of the phrase militant democracy now, which is about giving force to the state to protect itself from the people. Is that right to categorize the big change from the ancient to the modern concept of democracy?
Well, I don't see such a big difference because in ancient Greece, there was no such a thing as a modern state. But they were entitled to protect the basic values of their community. Whoever was seen as a traitor or as someone just doing something inherently bad, violating the basic norms of the community, was ostracized, was sent away from the community, which was considered to be worse than death. That is, you were ousted of the community. So, I mean, this sort of community was also militant in the sense that it had measures, institutions and provisions to protect its core values.
It was a very limited form now, it's just one every 10 years or so.
Can I jump in? I'm sorry, I just really went, of course we always talk about ancient Greece, but I think, ancient Greece was obviously not a democracy. I mean, what I was trying to imply earlier, I'm sorry to jump in, is that democracy is more than a decision-making process. Democracy, as we see it, I mean, this whole, the democracy is basically the political framework. You can look at it as a religion. It's a political framework how we look at how the world seems to be sustainable after the Second World War. It's international frameworks. It implies human rights. It implies all these things besides the democratic process. Ancient Greece, where only males were obviously members of the political community. I mean, we talk about Saudi Arabia, women not being allowed to drive, etc. I mean, think about the ancient Greeks. I mean, they were not part of the political community. So,
no, absolutely. And I'll bring Frank in a minute, but I just wanted you to pick up on where you finished with the need to accept a certain degree of contradictions and exceptions. Could you give some examples of the sort of exceptions you think democracy has to live with?
Okay, sorry for jumping you.
No.
I mean, I think, again, this is, so having rules that limit freedom are inherent to any political community. The question is, of course, where we draw these lines. I mean, norms. I mean, I think this sort of intolerance for intolerance. This is playing with words, really. Because democracy, if it's a constitutional democracy, means that we shouldn't be tolerant. There's absolutely no need to be tolerant about. It means that we're tolerant for unharmful democratic participants of this democratic process. People who are child molesters, people who are criminals, people who are terrorists, people who want to give human sacrifice and hide under the freedom of religion should not be given the freedom and liberty to enjoy freedom of religion, because that simply is beyond the concept. So I really think this is a manipulative play with words. The question is, of course...
Do you recognise, as Frank, I think you were implying, that there's been a shift in emphasis, whereas once in the 19th century, liberals were trying to expand the possibilities of freedom, maybe not for child rapists, but for the rest of us, whereas now, do you recognise any truth in the idea that liberals might be concerned with increasing the limits? Has there been any shift in society? No, I'm still asking you.
That is exactly the £1 million question, I would say. Where do you draw the line? I think that some exceptions are okay. I think a Germany type of constitutional democracy said, okay, where free speech is extremely important, except for Holocaust denial. We don't do that, given our history, that you don't go there. And everything else goes. Of course, a lot depends on the traditions of how much patronizing by the state is required and accepted by people. I think there's also an ironic thing that weak democracies, many weak democracies like Hungary, for example, has had a long tradition requiring a patronizing state, a state that is very active in saying.
Okay. Well, in fact, I'll bring you in now, Kim.
I would say that tolerance, if you use it in a very precise way, is very different than the way you talked about it. It's not the tolerance of pedophiles or of people. Tolerance is only about the domain of ideas, about the content of ideas. And what the liberal position is that you never ban any speech acts on the basis of their content. So the issue is the content, the right to voice whatever opinion you would like to see, which is different than saying that you tolerate sort of pedophiles or you tolerate murderers. That's an irrational way of using the concept. I think the reason why we have a dilemma is very simply this. Ever since Greece, in fact, even though it wasn't a democracy, in the way that we understand it, there's been a dilemma, which is that any form of representative government inherently raises the tension between the people and their representatives. It raises the tension between, sort of the fact that sometimes their representatives feel that they know better than the people what's in their interest. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. Right? And that's where the tension is. Who do you rely on at the end of the day? And do you rely upon people who possibly know better than everybody else does what this country needs? Or do you rely upon the population? It's a very difficult question to answer. Now, I think historically the way one can approach the subject is that there is a spectrum. And there's an authoritarian spectrum. I think the basic law in Germany is a very good example of that, which basically says that we're fairly sort of worried about what can be said, what can be done, and therefore we're going to build a constitution like that that's going to prevent that. And there is the other extreme, which is that of direct democracy, which basically says that any form of representation, I suppose an anarchic position, violates the whole democratic ethos. I think that in the 21st century, we're gradually moving towards the authoritarian end. And what's different about the 21st century to the 20th century is that in the 20th century, except for the Stalinist movement, the move towards authoritarianism was really promoted by the right of the political spectrum. Today, in the 21st century, I would say that the left, as much as the right, is moving, although they're using very different arguments and making very different claims as to why they're doing it, they're both pushing in the same kind of direction. And what you find is that if you go around, Europe is a good example, the constituency for what I said, for genuine tolerance, you do recognize paradoxes, we live in the real world, we do recognize tensions. The audience and the constituency for real tolerance is rather feeble at the moment. Precisely because there's been this ideological fusion, where essentially there's a symmetrical, almost a mirror image relationship between the left and the right, as to what they want to ban, what cannot be said. It's kind of a competition. So if you're on the right, you don't like immigrants, you don't like Jews, you don't like black people, you like all that kind of stuff. So they should, they should be banned. If you're on the left, you kind of don't like homophobics, you don't like xenophobes, you don't like populist movements of all sorts. So they're far better silenced than allowed to speak. I myself, as an old-fashioned liberal, I'm at a loss as to know, sort of who I feel closer to in such circumstances, given the fact that the essential epistemological approach is identical, is really identical. And I think that, the only difference is the excuses and the double standards.
Okay, since there's a lot to talk about, I'll bring you all in a minute. If there were any quick things that you wanted to add.
Yeah, just as a philosopher, I was wondering about the relationship of security and freedom. I mean, in our everyday lives, we do make these trade-offs happen. I mean, think about just just transportation rules, or just you can't drive too fast. Is this bad? Is this a limit on our freedom? Yeah, certainly. Do we mind it? I think no. The same just wearing guns. Is this a limitation of your individual freedom? Certainly. Is this for security? Certainly. Is this against any kind of liberal democratic norms? I don't think so.
Okay, so lots to discuss, as I say. You put your hand up, you want to talk. I'll take 3 or 5 at a time in a group and then get the panel to come back. So if you'd like to be first, don't be shy. Questions or points? Anna, why don't you kick us off?
And that's just to encourage others. So as far as I know, in classical liberal argument, the self-regulation of communities, professional communities like media and other kind of communities, is often suggested as an alternative to banning hate speech, for example. Do you believe that this kind of self-regulation can be trusted in today's Western societies, Western including Hungarian this time? Anyone who wants to?
Okay, say I'll take a number of points and then let the panel come back on all or any or none of what you all raised. You, Ben,
my question is going to be pretty personal.
change a bit.
Excuse me, my question is going to be pretty personal because we were talking about, you were using actually very symbolic terms, but I'm actually asking as a citizen about democracy, that it might sound simplistic to ask this, but how am I expected to protect my democracy? Am I expected to protect it from something? What are the tools that I'm given to protect it? Am I involved in any kind of process like this? Do I have any kind of rule or role in this? Or is it still democracy as a term? Do I have access to it besides philosophical norms? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And you, sir.
I think everybody knows the basic question by most of the people I hear and participating in this debate, and let me dramatize it. The question is, when one part of a population is playing contract bridge, and the other part of the population is playing American football, what do you do in this situation for the contract bridge people not to lose the game? That's, according to my views, the basic question. It might sound very exaggerated, but I think it applies to the present situation, at least in our country.
So may I next the question, what do we do if one side doesn't play fair and who's the referee?
Can we beat American football by contract bridge rules or no?
I'd like to see it try. Any more questions now? I'll bring back panel for some responses.
Where would you put leaking websites and other tools like that which are on the boundary of legal or non-legal things? I mean, do you put it in the category of yes, it's allowed to use it but only to defend democracy, or would you forbid people to use it, or what would you say about it?
Okay. Any more for the moment? Okay. In any order?
Yeah, I'm not standing up, it's probably so whether it's enough to have self-regulation as an instrument against hate speech, I mean the answer is shortly no, because usually you don't have, I mean sometimes do, but usually you don't have hate speech in like big newspapers or in big TVs, but it's like small websites they just don't care about but they are not even member of any self-regulating. sometimes they are very often they are not. So if you just concentrate on this one for self-regulation, then definitely you miss, I would say, most of this. So that would be one thing. The next thing, what can a settler citizen do?
Just one thing, András, you don't have to, you can, but
okay,
you don't have to come back on everything.
Okay.
Another, whichever questions and points you.
Okay, then I just make the second point and then I leave the floor. So, what can a citizen do in order to defend democracy? As a matter of fact, not so much. I mean, what you can do is like vote for democratic process of elections, and I mean, in theory, in some constitutions, you have the right to resist. You know, if there is a kind of coup d'état, and the state loses all its possibilities to protect itself. You do have in constitutions the right to resist such movements or such events. But as a matter of fact, I mean these rights in the constitution are rather of symbolic force because you can use them only when the constitution and the whole democratic system already failed. So it's rather some kind of testament for the democracy. But I don't think that it's efficient. I mean, it does have a certain rhetorical value. It's not useless, but in practice, it's not practically useful.
Okay. András, the American football contract range question, just the kind of key one. Is it just naive and hopeless and stupid of Democrats to think that they can afford to tolerate the intolerant, those people who don't play fair?
That's an excellent question. By answering that, I might refer to the question of who protects democracy. I think it's exactly the point here that democracy it's great if democracy can protect itself without the external guardianship of the state. If citizens operate democracy in a sustainable manner, that's great. The question is, and this is where militant democracy comes in, if this does not work because the natural immune system of democracy is weak, because there is a bacteria that needs to be found, sorry for being too dramatic, or because it's young, or because it's then we have certain exceptions that might help this system be sustainable. I think that is the question. And WikiLeaks is a perfect. I think it's a great symbol for this. I don't know. WikiLeaks it really shows the complexity of this whole game. WikiLeaks is a perfect tool to make democracy work because you can actually see the secrets of the state and you can make them accountable. On the other hand, I do believe that a state is allowed to have national security. Data that should be national security. I mean, I think all states have, secret operations. That's not okay if these involve human rights violations and waterboarding and illegal, detentions and etc. But I think, states do deserve a right to operate in privacy. That has always been sort of the world. I don't really have the answer to this. What I do is the last thing I would, however, like to emphasize, this is what, coming back to what Szabolcs said, that we have to see that, liberty is really never uncurtailed. I mean, the state, lawyers, politicians have this privilege to actually limit our freedom. They do it for two reasons. One of the reasons is the social contract. We do limit our freedom, so the common good, so that we, on the long run, will have, better lives. But also, we shouldn't forget that states have prerogatives to limit our freedom because they want to protect us from ourselves. Trans-fat, you shouldn't be eating that. Why should you wear a seatbelt? This is certainly a limitation. They're protecting me from myself. This is something that is again inherent in democracy. We have learned and we have been okay coexisting with this.
But that certainly goes much further than the classic interpretation of, say, J.S. Mill's harm principle, which was do what you like, say what you like, as long as you don't harm anyone else. But you're now talking about authorities who don't even let us harm ourselves.
I'm just saying that this has been, without maybe an explicit recognition, but this has been part of our political system and legal system for a very long time.
Okay. Frank, anything you want to pick up on?
Well, seems to me that one of the things that you seem to be arguing is that democracy is good in theory but not in practice. And I think there's a confusion being introduced because restraints on freedom, we can debate it as to whether it's good or bad, on seat belts or sort of things. Restraints on the freedom to kill people, to shoot, fine, you can discuss those. But restraints on the freedom of speech is very different. It's fundamentally different. Because it's through the Speech Act, it's through voicing an opinion, that all of our other freedoms are underwritten. You take away that freedom, you curtail it, then every other freedom becomes entirely flimsy and very, very narrow. And you ask the question, what does the citizen do? Well, the one weapon the citizen has is their voice. It is your voice that you choose to exercise in different dimensions that is ultimate guarantor of democracy.
I'm glad you used her.
Right? In every circumstance, that's always been the key element. You can ban hate speech, you can ban all these bad ideas, but if you haven't fought them with your voice, if you haven't discredited them, then you're in real trouble, as we're now discovering in Western Europe. The EU got all these incredible laws, but in France, in England, in Germany, you talk to normal people, and their opinion, their real opinions, which they're not allowed to express, is quite disturbing. But what's even more disturbing is that nobody has bothered to discuss with them, to argue with them, because they relied on these militant democratic solutions of driving it underground by using bureaucratic means. I think that's really where we have a very, very big problem. You see, there's always many rules in politics. That's the way it goes. But the question becomes, if we think our rules are good, do we just give them up at the first difficulty and say, well, democratic rules are perfect, on a Sunday when we go to church. But on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, we become like they are. Because if you do that, then essentially what we're doing is we're giving up on the idea. And what I'm really surprised at is that almost everybody here is some kind of an intellectual, I would imagine. Almost everybody here must be a little bit interested in ideas, a little bit interested in the power of ideas, and yet we seem to have given up on the fact that ideas can have power. If they are articulated eloquently with force, then the most backward, sort of terrible things that are out there can be fought. Right? If you don't fight them, we'll never know the case. But it seems to me that's what the key issues are to be fought, rather than hiding behind constitutional or administrative solutions. And we have to be consistent. For example, I don't like WikiLeaks at all. I have to confess. I think it's a very immature, infantile act. But as a Democrat, I have to completely support their right to do it. And I'm against the policing of what they're doing. And I think they have their, if they've done that, in the end, you have to recognize it might be very embarrassing, it might be very infantile, but in the end, the truth, the facts, are not going to kill anybody. They're not going to hurt you. And therefore, you have to, in a sense, provide them with the freedom to do that. I mean, either you have freedom on the internet, or you don't. It's very difficult to have a nuanced regulatory mechanism that sort of censors some ideas but not others. Even pornography is a difficult issue in relation to that. As much as we hate it, sort of where do you stop? We can discuss these things and we can educate ourselves to isolate it, which is what we should be doing, isolating it, marginalizing it, stigmatizing it, discrediting it, but not relying on the police to do the job of the intellectual.
Okay, I'll bring Szabolcs in now, but since you're a room of freedom-loving ideas, supporting intellectuals, I can see all the hands go up. But first,
just two brief thoughts. Going back to Frankenstein, I very much agree in theory with the distinction of action and speech. But you also mentioned, Frank, that ideas have power. First, you speak about speech acts, which the term itself implies that speaking is acting. I mean, just if I say right now, I stand up on the table and shout, hang the Jews or kill the Muslims. I mean, is this just speech? No, it's action. You just can't strictly separate speech from act. First, second, I mean, even those philosophers, John Stuart Mill, you referred to him, assumed that you can, back in the 19th century. He also had an idea that, well, of course, educated, smart, rational people can separate speeches from acts. And, they're not stupid. buy into extremist rhetoric. However, to make sure that this will not happen, he also saw the responsibility of the state to educate people. That is, just mandatorily to enlighten them, which is also some kind of, would have been compulsory against individual freedom, or at least one understanding of individual freedom. So, yeah.
Okay. Hotly debated issues for a long time. What do you all think? Everybody can put their hand up at the same time as well. So put a couple here and then start thinking over this side. I'll come that way. So you first.
Okay, I have several questions. The first two are kind of quick shots.
Shout a little bit more.
Sorry, the first two are quick shots, and the first goes to András Jakab. What do you think, can you draw the difference between dictatorship and democracy? When democracy accepts nothing but democracy. The second quick one is to Szabolcs, and I was very intrigued by it's provocative to me, your association or your example with the car and the speed limit. And I was just wondering if you can reflect now, when the first car was invented, the speed limit, and its capacity to go with the speed was probably much lower, like 25 kilometers an hour, 260, and can you see this progression of the vehicle also? Now it parallels to the wow as we develop also. And my next one goes to you. It really resonated, what you were saying with me. I'm based in Eastern Hungary, and I spend a lot of my time with people who would self-identify with nationalist sensitivity or Jobbik voters or whatnot. And spending time in this region, whatever ideas I might have had, I deal daily with the experience of people and their articulation that, we have had too much tolerance here. There has been too much tolerance towards minority, too much leniency and too much accommodation, and too little kind of emphasis on political unity. And so toleration, has come to be seen as the cause of the social problem by the people there, and so there's the emergence of this kind of people who call principle of intolerance, which is seen as needed to protect the rights of individuals and rights of communities. And this is my practical experience of living there. So what you're saying is very much like I wonder how we can but if you allow me to just make one more step.
Yeah, one quick one.
Because it just relates to what you said, Szabolcs, about the difference between acts and speech and how it's impossible to separate. I come from Bulgaria, where a few weeks ago we had sort of very contentious and controversial events after Kapunica, which was this kind of local small conflict, and then you had, protests spreading across the nation that put Bulgaria on the top of, headlines in the international media. We don't have usually. And then you have people of all sorts of walks of life coming out and chanting, the typical Bulgarian. We had gypsies into souls and Turks under the knife, which is usually reserved for just nationalists, but in this case it was spontaneous outbursts of people coming to the square and shouting. Now I don't think these people were advocating something like that, or if they really meant or advocated such an act, but for them it was just the only existing frame for which to articulate their discontent and their kind of feeling of powerlessness. So I very much separate.
One thing to consider around that, in the UK at the moment there's a lot of repressive legislation around what songs you're allowed to sing at football matches, because it might really upset the people on the opposing team. And they do sing a lot of very offensive things, but nothing happens, right? But it doesn't stop people wanting to bring in new laws to stop them. And is there a danger that with the Speech Act distinction narrowing, that we give undue importance to the ability of words to cause us offence? In a way that children sometimes think that words have a magical power. You say chocolate and it appears. Right? It's like that, or the idea of magic itself in primitive societies. You utter the name of somebody and it gives you power over them. But as grown-ups, don't we know that these things are very different, and that when you put things in a context rather than just abstract. But anyway, so something to think about. There was a hand here.
Yes, so just a few remarks first. I do agree that acts and speech are somewhat linked, and that when you speak, you're preparing your mind and body to act in some way. But I do buy into the whole idea that you should regulate acts and not speech. That being said, even if you have free speech, I'm afraid that in modern democracy, and especially in France, where I come from, which is the only country I can actually speak about, we have democracy, we have somewhat free speech, actually, many ideas are regulated, but the power in place, they are tweaking the rules of democracy slightly enough so that you do not notice them. But for example, a good example is that they are redefining the areas where you elect your representative to the parliament. So that, for example, for foreigners or French people abroad, none of the representative will be from the left. They will all be from the right because they are associating majoritarily, I don't know how to say that, but they associate right countries with left countries, and you're making sure that no, a group of left countries will be left so that they will have a representative in the parliament. You get to elect your president directly, but this is not the only power, and so many of the less visible powers, they are tweaked a little, slightly, like I said, just to ensure that even though it seems very democratic, they ensure that they get the result that they want. So I wanted to know, just my question is there, are there basic rules, set of rules for democracy to ensure some real democracy? Or are any rules okay with democracy? Are there rules for democratic systems that are more democratic than others?
Is there an essence you have to have?
Yes.
Okay. Any more questions? We've got some time. So there's a gentleman in the middle, and do put your hands up. I'll take 3 or 4 more. But, yes.
So I'd like to do some stimulate the discussion by.
Could you shout a little bit more?
Sorry.
Stand and.
I can't stand because of the subway.
Okay,
I will try to give some more input to the discussion by going back a little bit to the constitutional theory grounding of the whole issue. We started talking about the Kelsen, and I would also add the big confrontation between what was the two opposite, the Kelsen and the Schmidt theories, so the more liberal and the more conservative. And historical experience showed that both of them had strong weaknesses, through to what we have seen in Germany especially. And what happened to the constitutional theory is we had, especially in Italy and Germany after the Second World War, this new constitution where some have been called by some scholars ethnic constitution, so they were having some manifesto of values which were a guide and also limits for the legislator and for the interpreters of the law. So what happened, in my opinion, here is a sort of synthesis between these two kind of views, like the liberal and the conservative one. So what for Kelsen was a procedural practice, so the pluralism, and became from a procedure to a content. So the pluralism and the liberal argument became the value enshrined in the Constitution. This meant, this created somehow, in my opinion, the fertile ground for possible protection of democracy, so what are we discussing today? Because in a case of a purely liberal constitution of the Kelsen model, there is nothing to protect, obviously. So this kind of paradox has been called by Stefano Ceccanti, who is an Italian scholar who wrote an interesting book about this topic, the relativity of relativism. Because the fact of accepting every opinion, it's itself an opinion which is in a value in the Constitution.
Okay, good. This is a special kind of free speech area tonight, where you are allowed to say whatever you want, and it won't have any consequences, except for you getting your point across. If you don't, you'll regret, I know, when you go home. Yes?
Yes, well, my question maybe is not really crucial, but I have a question particularly addressed to Szabolcs Pogonyi. So you mentioned something about philosophical core rules, values, actually, and I just keep wondering whether, according to these core values, who would be entitled by whom to define what is what is the border, what is democratic, and who could say that, okay, I say that it is not democratic anymore. So yeah.
Yeah, no, very good question. Who defines the boundaries and who decides what the values are?
Yeah, this is directed to Frank. I just wondered if you could speak a little more about this distinction between speech and action, and whether you think that threat is something in between, and to what extent we need to regulate threatening language, say against minorities or whatever. How do you deal with that? I mean, in Britain we had a very interesting election last year where we had a very highly debated public debate with the leading parties plus the far right, or the fairly far right party included for the first time, but not the extreme right. They were excluded still. So, yeah, how do you talk about this distinction between speech, action, and somewhere in between, threats in between?
Okay. Who'd like to come back?
Can I answer that?
You want to come back on that directly and then pick up on what you
Well,
want?
I'm probably one of the few academics in England who's debated both the far right, the British National Party, and also the jihadist fundamentalists. Not because I loved them or anything like that, but because I felt that unless their ideas are taken up in front of an audience, you're not going to have any chance of discrediting what are horrible, reactionary, disgusting opinions. And I am concerned that even intelligent, democratic-minded people accept the category of hate speech, and the fact that there are certain forms of speech that are on the grounds of content alone can be legally banned. I mean, I give a lecture in Amsterdam, and I had a Jewish and a Muslim guy on my platform, and it really summed up the problem for me, because the Jewish guy completely agreed with me. Sort of when I said it was in a free society, we should have the right to make statements that are critical of the Prophet Muhammad. He thought that was really good, and he clapped me all the way with my speech. The Muslim guy, on the other hand, felt that I was totally right when I said that it was wrong to ban Holocaust denial. He said, how can you? That's a matter of history. How can you ban doing that? But on the other hand, they were both 100% sort of certain that if you're Jewish, from a Jewish point of view, you have to ban Holocaust denial, and from a Muslim point of view, the Prophet cannot be criticized. Right? So that to me sums up the problem that we don't really, and the way around it, I think, very simple. On the basis of content of speech, nothing can be banned. Right? Nothing can be banned, even though they could be offensive. If a Jewish person hears some anti-Semitic comments, they're not going to go away smiling. If a homosexual is exposed to horrible sentiments, they're not going to be very happy about it. But we're mature adults, we have to learn to live with that. The difference between the content of speech and, for example, going in front of the house of Roma people and saying, let's burn down the house. That's in American sort of legal jurisprudence, we make a distinction that's called clear and present danger. And basically say that in those circumstances, it's no longer the content of the speech that's being sort of regulated, but it's what is a physical threat that's directed to the people. And under those circumstances, it's quite legitimate. It's not easy because, as you were saying, in these paradoxes, it's never black and white, but I think as long as we make a conceptual distinction between the content and the threat, and we kind of do our best to kind of define that we're going in the right kind of direction. And that's really, how I would say, and therefore I think in Britain, I'm very sad that we have, a new law of incitement to religious hatred, which basically means that comedians making fun of, sort of religions cannot make good, which is crazy. That we have new laws now being introduced in Scotland where football fans cannot make fun of each other, and okay, they're not very nice songs, but football fans are not going to be gentle, sort of polite individuals. And there's a whole number of laws, and every year, every month, new laws are being introduced that something new cannot be said. I think once you go down that road, the number of words that are bad, it becomes like the Inquisition in the old days. It expands.
András, you don't agree?
No, I don't. Let me just get it straight. I'm absolutely no fan of banning hate, banning certain type of speech in general. What I'm saying is that it can be okay, it is compatible with democracy. Now, I really have to disagree with you saying that on the basis of content you cannot limit speech. That is an absurd thing to say, I'm sorry. When you are prohibiting fighting words, when you are, this is the classic American jurisprudence, very long, centuries long example, you cannot shout fire in a crowded theatre hall. Clear and present danger, that is the content of the speech. When you say that the consequences of your speech is going to be action that limits other people's physical security or dignity, etc., you are prohibiting speech exactly on the basis of its content. I do not want to be in a position saying where you can draw the boundaries. What I'm saying is that when we talk about democracy, democracy is constitutional democracy. There are, being a lawyer, I'm in a very easy position. Lawyers who do this, members of constitutional courts, even politicians, they have these procedures of weighting, interests. This is proportionality or balancing. They are balancing various interests. Speech. Let's see it, and I will answer your question by this. What is the difference between a democracy and a dictatorship? Why do we value speech so much? Because speech is probably the most important thing that is within human quality. This is what makes us human. Vegetables don't speak, animals don't speak. Speech is something how we express ourselves, how we develop, how we make relationships. That's why it's so important. But, and here comes the very important thing, it's all a religion of human rights, basically. This is the fundamental organizing principle, and I should have to say, if I'm really sort of simplifying things, since the Second World War, say that political leaders came to the conclusion after the horrors of the Second World War that this is, from now on, we do adopt a certain basic parameters that how the world should be run. Now, the political framework for human rights is this fragile, contradictory, however somewhat sustainable system. This is what we call democracy, a constitutional democracy. A constitutional democracy involves the weighting of various constitutional principles. And I have to say that how we usually define democracy is checks and balances, separation of powers, procedure of things for state bodies. These are just the instruments
But yes, but listening to it, you're saying free speech, wonderful, but fundamentally.
But
so how do you
because it's not an isolated concept. Human rights are always in conflict with each other. They do not exist in a vacuum. You always need to balance things because they're always going to be in conflict with one another. So speech is certainly not something that is above everything. It's a holistic, you need to adopt, and this is what constitutional lawyers do. Again, it's a very simplified worldview that lawyers have. We adopt, a holistic, say, okay, we're going to balance these interests, we're going to balance these rights. Human speech is certainly very up on the ladder, but there's dignity, there are other things. Libel, for example, no one can say that they can actually say your business is crap.
Bring in the other two, we'll agree. So we've got free speech, absolutely, they're saying free speech, but limited by umpires.
Just a couple of words. So as for, I fully agree with Frank that the examples he brought up are just ridiculous. In those cases, I think, most of us would not advocate the limitations of free speech, as the comedians and so forth. What I'm against is just this absolutist idea that once you have certain limitations, then there's a slippery slope, and you will end up in some kind of, horrible political system. Now, going back to the cars, that is, where to limit, how to limit. Yes. 100 years ago, cars were slower, but even then you had limitations. That is, someone was, as far as I know, when you drove your car, you had to hire someone with a flag waving to make sure that you won't hit someone. Now we have a different world. We have faster cars. You need now different sort of limitations. You have mass media. It's not only just face-to-face contacts. You need different limitations. And the final remark is, as for threats. I mean, in this situation, it was only words. That is just horrible words about certain minorities. But if I was within the house, I would have been really afraid. If I had kids, I guess, I mean, I would both they and I would have felt very bad. And this is harm itself. I mean, if I couldn't sleep, my kids were crying, that would be real harm. That should not be allowed, even if there's no violence. And you never know when violence will just erupt.
András? Yeah, I mean, who defines what's democracy? I mean, at the end of the day, structurally, constitutional democracy is the constitutional core. So they would just say what's kind of democracy, and everybody else said something else, they were wrong by definition. And the second issue about whether law enforcement mechanisms are efficient to protect democracy. They might be efficient, or they are actually efficient against small aggressive minorities, but against to protect democracy against the majority itself is pretty much hopeless. There was a third question about Hans Kelsen and Carl Schmitt, but I would. You want to? No. Okay. So I would pass that.
All right, so we've got time really quick, last points before I bring in the panel to sum up. So I'll take as many as I can. On any of this? Anybody who hasn't spoken before? This will be your sort of last chance. So if you have got any burning thoughts or questions before you go home. Frank did say one thing I noticed caused a bit of a stir, which was to say that liberals can be a bit confused at the narrow ground that people who think of themselves on the left and people who think of themselves on the right are both pushing in a more authoritarian way. One of the words that's become very popular in the US and the UK is the concept of zero tolerance. That there are some things that we won't even bother trying to put in a context or evaluate the harm that they may not or may not have done. There will just be zero tolerance for those kinds of statements. Okay, unless there are any new ones, I'll take you first, then you, sir. Keep the comments quick, and then we'll bring in the panel to sum up.
Just very quickly, my emotions after coming out of this evening. Just it seems that we're so concerned with how much to allow, where to draw the line. Everyone is just talking about that, but I mean, wouldn't it be so great if instead we just had a genuine political leadership who can sort of even learn a little bit from the extremists and appeal to people's emotions and kind of create that feeling of community, of whatever it is that is perceived as eroding and is what people did. In my experiences from Miskolc or from studying the Hungarian kind of nationalism, I think that, if we just had a genuine leader who could appeal to the electorate, there wouldn't be so many, ballots cast for Jobbik. And in the Bulgarian case also, I have to tell you that Ataka, which emerged, and the Bulgarian nationalism emerged at the situation of not crisis, but when there was total stability, and there was the so-called liberal consensus ruling. And it became so successful because of that, and it continues to grow. I wouldn't ban the people who until today continue walking around in the country with t-shirts saying, I don't want to live in a gypsy country. That's, following the events now in the second part of September. I wouldn't tell them to take their shirts off, but I would somehow, I don't know, wish a political leader that would kind of change the situation, not a law against the shirts.
Do you want to say something quickly, Frank, and then I'll take you to the back end?
Just, I was in Miskolc last year, mainly because one of my PhD students wants to do her PhD on talking to the Jobbik people and finding out was made. So I went there and had a chat, and I was actually quite shocked, because when you talk to them, you can really understand why they moved in that direction. And even though they have the most backward views on Jews and Roma people and other things, and this kind of Christian stuff, when you actually scratch the surface, there's also, they were relieved that I wasn't from Budapest. They say Budapest people just shit on them. And they really think that anything that and when you talk to them, what they really are expressing is that kind of fragmented, atomized, very privatized sense of detachment, where they've been let down by generation after generation, people have lied to them. And then, when you actually talk to them, they're very similar to some of the French people, in the banlieues of the big cities. Emotionally, what they're saying is very, very similar. And the thing that really occurred to me is that who has ever talked to these people other than Jobbik? Who has ever addressed their concerns? And I think to me, that was really sad, because you felt that these are people that could be won. These are not irredeemable racist fascists that are never going to move. They can be moved. But the only way they're going to be moved is if somebody takes them seriously and has a conversation with them and tries to take up their wrong views and tries to discredit Jobbik politically, not by saying that they're just Nazis and fascists, politically, in order to defeat them. If you don't do that, then we repeat exactly the same mistake as in the Weimar Republic, because there were militant democracies. A lot of Nazis and communists were banned, and there was all these calls to, not to do this and not to do that. The main effect of that was to make the Nazis more popular. That was the main accomplishment, and I think we should learn from the lesson of history. And whenever you try to drive this on the ground, it doesn't work. It has the opposite effect.
Okay, so there's all sorts of grumbling and a few hands going up. Maybe we need to go to a bar afterwards and carry this on, but you at the back, yeah.
It seems that you assume a kind of necessary connection between freedom of speech and freedom. But there is a counter-argument. So perhaps freedom of speech is a means to control people, because it ensures a perfect visibility. And then I have the impression that the state has the possibility to scrutinize its citizens, to see each of their words, to this kind of Foucauldian argument. So it can work the other way around as well. So this would be my question.
Okay, and at the front, do you want to?
Well, yeah, perhaps, because I think it's quite a self-complacent discussion, I think, because the constitutional scholars love to discuss, the relationship between free speech and militant democracy, and they can up with one or the other result. So I probably would agree with you as a matter of result, but I think the threats you are proposing as well are things that only happen in the Anglo-American world. I don't see your description of the problem existing in France or Spain or Germany in this way. This is in a way a very Anglo-American discourse. But on the other hand, I think the Weimar Constitution did not fail because people were so free to say everything they wanted. That is basically not a historically correct account of why Weimar failed. Weimar failed for many reasons which have nothing to do with freedom of speech. And so in a certain way, in Hungary 2011, to talk about the relationship of freedom of speech and militant democracy and to make a case for or against, what you can publicly say, under the heading of, militant democracy, seems to me has completely to fail the topic in a way. Because obviously, however you evaluate your own political situation, and I'm a foreigner, it's not to me to do that, it's not about this problem.
Okay, and so you had a hand up in the middle again, but very quick.
Yeah, it's good. In most of these cases, as far as I can see, it's always about two civic rights, two basic rights conflicting with each other. So, as has been already said, the constitutional courts have a very strong role in trying to find the right balance, strike the right balance between these two. And of course, every constitutional court has different tradition and different ways of solving this. So, but still, there is a bunch of big jurisprudence in the European Court of Human Rights. So, and they develop a particular tool. So, I would like to ask the panelists what they think about this tool, which is look at whether the limitation is provided by law, if it's for a legitimate aim, and if it's necessary in a democratic society. This is the framework. So you think if this is effective, is a good tool, or is it some shortcomings?
All right. Well, thank you all very much. Let's come out. I'm going to ask the speakers to sum up very quickly. Give the final takeaway point for people to remember, if nothing else? András,
well, I'll just be very brief. I mean, again, I would just like to say that democracy is imperfect. It's a commonplace, we always use it. Churchill's a million times the phrase, democracy is pretty bad. The only good thing about it is we haven't yet worked out anything that would be, as good as it is. I mean, having said this, democracy being imperfect, I think militant democracy is implied in it, that it needs to have sort of an extra aid to its immune system. Now, the big question has been raised here, who should protect democracy? I think ideally people operating democracy protect it. In a non-ideal world, which is the world we live in, I think the state has to have some kind of competences to protect democracy. The question is, of course, we really shouldn't let the state decide on the extent, because this is what we're talking about. Where do we draw the line? No one would disagree that some limits should be okay. Probably everybody here would disagree that a complete ban on speech, etc., would be not acceptable. So I guess the bottom line is we have a responsibility to operate this somewhat fragile system in this country, more fragile than in other countries. So we should their responsibility for this.
Okay, thank you. And I'll ask you to thank everybody again. So we're going to now double.
I have little to add. The problem is, Frank and George also said that yes, talk to your big people, talk to intolerant people, and hope that you may convince them that just Jews and Gypsies are not that bad. But at the end of the day, if you don't manage, you need some sticks, and the state will have to make sure that they can't spread these ideas, and otherwise they may turn violent. This is what I think.
Frank, your final thoughts?
On the question of who decides, I wish I had more time to talk about the Kelsen-Schmidt debate. It's very, very interesting. I'm writing a couple of chapters on that. My fear is that the Kelsen influence has become quite powerful in the institutionalization of proceduralism, which has then led to what Habermas, when he was good, once called the juridification of everyday life, when the juridification process sort of gradually sort of begins to expand. And it leads me to a very simple observation, which is that at the end of the day, no matter what the institutions are, they are only institutions. And you can have the most formally democratic institution, but if people are switched off, if public life is weak, then those democratic institutions can behave in ways that are quite the opposite. And similarly, you can have very democratically minded politicians, and particularly lawyers, who I'm very suspicious of for a variety of reasons, judges, whose consequences will have unintended sort of effects, which are again very anti-democratic. And therefore, I would say that the history, maybe the experience of history is that on balance, you've got to create conditions where it's the people, not for populist reasons, but at the end of the day, sort of it's people who bear the consequences, who pay the price for whatever decisions are being made. That somehow they are in a position where their changing voice can begin to influence, kind of who decides. At least, in a way that's more open than is the case at the moment. I think Weimar is a very good example. I disagree with you in one respect. I agree it wasn't free speech that was the issue. I do think that Weimar wasn't inevitable. What happened after Weimar wasn't inevitable. And a lot of it had to do with precisely these kinds of discussion of how do you politically deal with the enemies of democracy. So that was the question. I think the KPD and the Social Democratic Party really screwed up big time. And to some extent, KPD in particular, by adopting National Bolshevism, played into the hands of the Nazis, and the Social Democratic Party was just of their rear end, and ended up in a situation where, to some extent, their own role, is one that bears. They obviously they're not responsible for the terrible things that occurred, but their bad political judgment was an important element in what happened later on.
Thanks, András.
Yeah, just in one sentence. I think to protect democracy against aggressive minorities, you can have pretty good legal instruments to do that. But to protect democracy against majority, it's more or less hopeless. So if you have such a problem, then it's not about finding legal instruments, it's rather about changing the culture or having a democratic culture in a country. And I'm rather skeptical about how far it can be done by direct legal instruments.
Okay, can we thank our panel?
Thank you all very much for coming along. My kind of final last thought on this is that whenever we're fearful of majorities, we're being fearful of people. And that at the end of the day probably means being fearful of you as individuals as well. So I think you can't always afford to be fearful of the other guy and what he might think. Thank you again for coming. And Anna, I don't know if people want to carry on informally.
If you want to go on with the discussion, we can just walk around the corner. There's a small cafe and a restaurant, so whoever wants to join, please join us, and let's go on with this. Thank you very much for coming.